During the UFC break last week, I went through all the fights this year up to UFC 306 to see which odds have been the most profitable for both the favorites and the underdogs. I also looked at whether there's any difference in results between the red and the blue corners. For this analysis, we pretend to have placed a $100 bet on all fighters to win the fight, and we use the odds from the tail of the tape shown before each fight. So, without further ado, let's dive into the results and see if we can uncover anything interesting. We start with favorites versus underdogs for all corners. We had a total of 375 fights. Out of those fights, 9 were exactly even in odds, which we will look at later. And in 366 fights, we had a favorite and an underdog. The underdogs performed much worse than the favorites overall. Betting every underdog this year would have given you a minus 14.2% return of investment compared to the favorites with a minus 0.5%. In this slide, we start with the biggest favorites at the top with minus 1501 to minus 2400. For this year, there were only 2 fighters who were such big favorites. And as we go down the list, more and more smaller favorites are being added to the totals. And 2 things, or 3 things actually, are noticeable. You would have always made a profit if you bet the favorite fighter with over minus 201 in odds. Secondly, there's a huge spike in profit between 251 to minus 2400 with 6.9% return of investment, but after that it goes down again. We'll get into the specifics a bit more later on. And thirdly, always betting very huge favorites seems to be very profitable this year. Betting fighters with over minus 751 in odds would have gained you 9% return of investment. In this slide we do the opposite of the previous slide. So we're slowly excluding the biggest favorite and always keep in the smallest favorites. And here there's only a bit of profit at the bottom with the smallest favorites. And now we go into the specifics and find out which range of odds were the most and least profitable. Betting the favorites this year with odds between minus 176 and minus 250 had the worst results. The most profitable odds for the favorites were between minus 251 to minus 300 with 22.6% return of investment, then minus 151 to minus 175 with 12.4%, then at the top the biggest favorites with 9%, and finally with 7.6% odds between minus 301 to minus 350. Now we go look at the results for all the underdogs this year. And as you can see, always having the biggest underdog and slowly adding smaller and smaller underdogs is always unprofitable. But adding more and more smaller underdogs makes the result less worse. Now, if we reverse it and always keep in the smallest underdog and slowly adding bigger and bigger underdogs, there are 2 areas where the return of investment gets a bit better before it gets worse again. And when we take a look at specific ranges for the underdogs, there are only 2 that were profitable, which are between 151 to 175 and 176 to 200. What is also noticeable is that a lot of the biggest underdog or pretty big underdogs have been very unprofitable to bet on, with a return of investment of around minus 50%. So yeah, overall, underdogs perform a lot worse than the favorites so far this year. And here is the result for all the underdogs and all the favorites with their odds and the results. And as you can see, the favorites in green are mostly in the top or in the top middle, whilst the underdogs are at the bottom or bottom middle. I've also checked the results for the favorites and the underdogs for the red and blue corner and found some interesting results. And to start the comparison between the red and the blue corner, we start with the exactly even odds of minus 110, or the so-called pick'em fights. And out of the 9 fights with even odds, the fighter in the blue corner won 7 times out of 9, and in the red corner only 2. When we look at the results for the favorites versus underdogs in the red corner, that out of the 366 fighters in the red corner, 223 were the favorite or 61% and 143 were the underdog for 39%. And here the favorites also performed better or less worse than the underdogs. When we look at the results for the biggest favorites and slowly including smaller and smaller favorites, it looks like the smaller favorites became unprofitable if you included them. But if you had always bet the favorite in the red corner with minus 251 or better, you would have made a return of investment of 8.4% over those 77 fighters. And betting on the biggest favorites seems to be very profitable this year so far. When we always include the smallest favorite and slowly start to exclude the biggest favorites, it doesn't look so pretty anymore. And the more we exclude the bigger favorites, the worse our return of investment gets. And when we start to look at specific ranges, we start to see some big differences in results. The small favorites in the red corner between -111 and -150 didn't perform very well, with around -10% return of investment. But fighters with the odds between -176 to -250 did a lot worse, with -17.5% up to -29.1%. There's only one range in the small favorites that performed pretty well, and that was the range between -151 to -175 for a 10.4% return of investment. The most profitable odds for fighters in the red corner was between -251 to -300 with a return of investment of 22%. And the biggest favorites with better than -501 in odds also performed pretty well. When we look at the underdog fighters in the red corner, we see something very interesting. When we always leave in the biggest underdog and slowly add smaller and smaller underdogs, the results tend to get worse. And betting on the biggest underdog in the red corner was pretty profitable this year. But when we reverse it and always have the smallest underdog and slowly removing the biggest underdogs, the results look very bad. Starting with a -23.1% return of investment and getting worse and worse. And when we look at specific ranges for underdog fighters in the red corner, most of them have been very unprofitable so far this year, with only two exceptions, with the underdog between 351 to 400 with 15% return of investment, and the biggest underdogs with 501 to 1200 in odds for a return of investment of 108%. But as you can see from the total, that were only 3 fighters and one of them managed to win. And here are all the results from best to worst for all the fighters in the red corner. And also here the favorite fighters perform better than the underdogs, with 2 exceptions for the underdogs that also performed well. Alright, time to look at the blue corner, and we immediately see something interesting. Fighters who were the favorite in the blue corner performed pretty well, and betting on them every time could have given you a 7.8% return of investment. By slowly removing the smaller favorites and always keeping in the biggest favorites, we can see that the results slowly get worse and worse until we get to the top. And when we reverse it and always keep in the smaller favorites and slowly removing the biggest favorite, it becomes more and more profitable. But there's also this part in the middle where the return of investment goes up. So let's go into the specifics and see what's happening. And as we can quickly see, the fighters that were the favorite in odds in the blue corner did very well in terms of return of investment. The worst performance can be found with the biggest favorites overall, specifically between -351 to -750 in odds. The medium to large favorites between -226 and -350 all had very good results, and the fighters that were a small favorite also did very well. The range at the bottom, -111 to -175. And finally, we take a look at the underdogs in the blue corner. Here at the top are the biggest underdogs, and slowly we're adding smaller underdogs when we go to the bottom. And as you can see, the results get better and better and better, although not profitable. But when we reverse it and always include the small underdogs and slowly adding bigger underdogs, we see that at the bottom and in the bottom middle the results are positive, but for the rest it's getting worse or negative. And when we look at specific ranges for underdogs in the blue corner, most of them are pretty unprofitable. The exceptions are between 151 to 175 with a very high return of investment of 39.5%, and then we have 2 other ranges, 176 to 200 and -109 to 110 with 8.9 and 5.5% return of investment. And here are the results for all fighters in the blue corner, with the even odds in yellow at the top with 48.5% return of investment. And here you see as well all the favorites are mostly at the top, and at the bottom you'll find the underdogs. That was it for this video with the odds and the results for this year so far. Hope you all enjoyed it and found it informative. If you want to support my channel and the content I create, you can support me on my Patreon for some extra benefits or at Buy Me a Coffee. Links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching or supporting, and I'll see you in the next video.